afternoon, everybody. My name's Saleem. I'm Director of External Relations here at the Warr Pavilion. It's really wonderful to welcome you here this afternoon on this fantastic day, and also a fantastic week, Refugee Week. Thank you so much for coming. It's also absolutely brilliant to work with the Refugee Buddy Project again. We've got a very long-standing relationship with this fantastic organisation. You may remember that last year we put on, even the year before, doesn't time bend over the past 2 years, we put on an exhibition with the Buddy Project called Pandemic Patchwork Stories, all in the same stall, Pandemic Patchwork Stories, which we worked on together. And in the end, that exhibition stayed up in our first floor gallery for quite a long time, open, close. It was a fantastic experience for everybody involved, the participants, ourselves as partners, and certainly for the audiences. So we're really, really happy to continue our relationship with the Buddy Project and to see you all here today. I also wanted to say that there will be a building tour after the panel discussion today. I'm going to lead that tour, so if you're interested in knowing a bit more about the pavilion, how it was built, why it was built, and what it does now, then please join me in the ground floor gallery 5 to 10 minutes after the discussion has finished. But in the meantime, thank you so much for coming, and I'll just pass you on to Rossana and the panel for you to enjoy your afternoon.
Thank you. So I'm just going to check. Are the mics on? Can you hear me? Yeah. And I now just want to check that this is working. It is. So thank you. So my name is Rossana Leal. I am the founder and now CEO of the Refugee Buddy Project. For those of you who don't know us, I started this organisation in 2017, and this was as a direct result of what we were seeing in the media at the time with the arrival of the Syrian refugees and the journeys they were making across the sea and across Europe to reach safety. But also, I wanted to set up a project which would welcome their refugees in the same way that my family had been welcomed way back in 1977 when we had come to the UK for refuge when we were escaping the Pinochet dictatorships in Chile. At that time, we were welcomed by the Scottish mining community, so you might hear a bit of a Scottish accent coming out now. We were welcomed and made to feel really safe by a local mining community in Fife, who kitted out a house for us, who filled the house up with I remember little Spanish dolls from the holidays in Spain. It was a little touch that I think they wanted to make us feel welcome. But I also remember sleeping in clean sheets in a clean bed for the first time in a long time and feeling safe. So I had and have first-hand experience of what it means to be welcomed by communities in different countries when you are seeking refuge. We set up a community cafe in 2019. It was a pop-up cafe which we had to close down during the pandemic. But we've just taken a new lease on a cafe, and we hope that that cafe will open up in August, and you will all be welcome to come there to drink Syrian tea, eat Syrian pastries, and generally come and support the newly arriving communities that are coming to the area. We reached charity status in 2020. We now have a fantastic board of trustees, some of whom are here this evening, hiding in the backgrounds. I can see them. They give their time on a voluntary basis and their amazing expertise. So we now have a group of fantastic people that we can go to seek advice and who give us guidance with the running of the project. We now are seeing 45 families, supporting 45 families in the various resettlement programs, and I'll go a little bit into that later. 10 families in the dispersal scheme. We have over 250 volunteers. We now have 6 part-time staff working at different levels in buddy coordinating, casework, and so on. And we have managed to secure 3 years' worth of development funding through the lottery to develop our work in Hastings and the East Sussex areas. So what does the project actually do? We connect newly arriving migrants and people seeking refuge with local buddies, with local volunteer people. People meet for a minimum of an hour a week for informal English conversation. We also now do employment preparation through our partnerships with Groundwork, a national organisation, and we support people to explore their new homes. So the buddies help the newly arriving people seeking refuge to explore their new home. That can be by meeting up for a coffee in a cafe, meeting up once a week to come to the Delaware, anything social that means that people can feel that they can explore this town safely with somebody that knows it. And more importantly, we do a variety of social gatherings and fantastic activities. We eat lots of Syrian food with our Syrian friends or Sudanese friends, and we are in the middle at the moment of Refugee Week, which is what this event is part of. We did a call to action to for the first time to the St Leonards and Hastings area. We did a call to action to the Hastings Creatives and Art Galleries, and the response to that has been amazing. It's resulted in a variety of activities that are currently happening, which end on Sunday with all of us going to Sanctuary Festival at Hastings Museum, organised by Hastings Communities of Sanctuaries. If that's not in your diary already, please make sure you attend that. That's a fantastic event. There's going to be discussions, debates, music. I've heard there's going to be free ice cream as well. So it's definitely worth going to that. Our closeness to the newly arriving communities seeking refuge has meant that we are able to experience and see firsthand, we're able to witness firsthand how these communities are attempting to make new lives in the UK, and particularly in East Sussex. And that's resulted in us putting together some reports, because we felt right at the beginning when we set up this project, we were hearing too many stories of people going to local hospitals or local GPs who weren't being given access to interpreters, and this was having a direct effect on how they could deal with their particular health needs. So we decided that the best thing to do was just to record these stories and put them into a report, which became the report called Lost in Translation, the need for interpreting services and access to the NHS for mainly refugee women at the time, because it was the women who were speaking out. And we were able to deliver this report to 40 clinicians at the Conquest Hospital, in a professional development session, and we're still hearing reports of the impact that this particular report has had on the people delivering services locally in the NHS. We've also, we were listening to how the families are experiencing access to schools and education, and there is a report, in fact the report is here, make sure you take a copy of it with you today. It's called Speaking and Listening, a report on the experiences of refugee families in education. Again, similar stories where we've recorded the actual experiences families are experiencing in our local schools. We have an ongoing collaboration with the local organisation called ECTUS to develop a psychosocial educational advocacy intervention for people seeking refuge. This is in its very early stages, but it means that we can look at where the gaps are in terms of how refugee communities access mental health support services in the area. Just double checking you've got the right one. Yeah. Yeah, so our key collaborations, there's a whole load there. I'm not going to go into any of those, but we now collaborate very, very closely with all the names that you see on this list to offer different kinds of supports to the newly arriving communities. So it's a resettlement programme, East Sussex County Council. The Warr Pavilion, we have been doing some amazing work with the Warr Pavilion, as you heard from Saleem earlier on. Thank you very much for hosting this fantastic event. We hope that this partnership will continue to develop in the future as we are seeing other refugees communities arriving in the area. So, in essence, we are a participant-led organisation. We are refugee and migrant-led. We work, our aim is to ensure that there is access to existing specialist support service for the newly arriving communities. We work with allocated caseworkers where relevant to support the families and the newly arriving people in making sure they have access to the existing services. We work with all the local services to ensure people's needs are being met with dignity and respect, and that's really important for us, given what you will see in some of the reports that we've written. And we also work to identify funding to meet the individual needs of some of the people who are arriving here to seek refuge. Sorry, I have to keep turning around because I'm not sure. Okay, so we have an open door to people seeking refuge. So when we started way back in 2017, we started supporting the people who were coming through the Vulnerable Persons Resettlement Programme, who they were mainly Syrian refugees. Since then, we've been supporting the people who have been arriving in the Afghanistan Citizens Resettlement Programme, and now we are helping and supporting the people in the Homes for the Ukraine programme. Throughout that time, we have always supported the people who are living in the Hastings area in the Home Office dispersal scheme. Yep. So, from our initial beginnings, where we wanted to be a befriending organisation, we've felt the need to expand, and this has been as a direct response to the needs of the communities that we work with. So today we work to raise the voices of migrant communities and people seeking refuge in the East Sussex area, and we work towards to ensuring that we make visible people's experience of trying to build a new life in the UK. And that's me, and I want to hand over now to Shannon, and we are here for any more questions later on as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Rossana. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this special event today. My name is Shannon Ghannam, and I'm a St Leonard's local, currently heading up the work of the Magnum Photos Foundation, which is an education foundation that uses photography in the community for social change. I've worked in the field of international documentary photography and photojournalism for some 20 years, most notably in roles at the Australian Red Cross, National Archives of Australia, Reuters, and Magnum Photos. And during that time, I've become fascinated with the work that images do in society, and in the context of this conversation, how powerful they can be in shaping our understanding of ourselves and each other. And I've become acutely aware of the narrow, mainly white male Western gaze that has produced the history of photography, the stereotypes created, and the ramifications of that gaze. And I've spent the past 5 years working in education with a special focus on supporting photographers who offer counter-narratives and underrepresented perspectives, and developing greater visual and media literacy. So it's been my great pleasure to work with Rossana on this event and bringing our incredible community together to discuss the critical issues in our panel today. So I'd like to introduce our speakers today. I'm afraid we have 2 of our speakers on Zoom because we had some transport issues. I can see them, but sadly you're not able to see them, and you weren't able to figure that out, but you will be able to hear them. And I'm really sorry that Amak and Jess have not experienced the incredible lunch that we all just had. So we have Daniel on the end of the panel. Daniel Trilling is a journalist and has reported extensively on refugees in Europe. His work has been published in The New Humanist, London Review of Books, The Guardian, New York Times, and others, and he won a 2017 Migration Media Award. His first book, Bloody Nasty People, The Rise of Britain's Far Right, was longlisted for the 2013 Orwell Prize. He published Lights in the Distance, Exile and Refuge at the Borders of Europe in 2018, and he lives in London. Thank you for joining us, Daniel. Saleem is a British Pakistani activist and campaigner born in Birmingham in the West Midlands. Hi Maz, thank you for joining us. Maz has been tirelessly campaigning against unjust wars, Islamophobia and racism for the last 7 years. She is the daughter of the late Saleem, who was stabbed in an Islamophobic and racially motivated murder in April 2013. His killer, Ukrainian national Pavlo Lapshin, went on to detonate 3 bombs near mosques in Warsaw, Tipton and Wolverhampton in June and July, and was making more in his flat before being arrested by counter-terrorism police. He was sentenced to a minimum of 40 years in prison. Maz's father's murder was a turning point for her in wanting to raise awareness about the unprecedented rise of Islamophobia and racism in Britain and across the world, because, to quote, tomorrow it could be someone else's father, mother, brother or sister who was murdered or attacked for simply looking visibly Muslim. Maz has written for a variety of publications, including The Independent, Stop the War Coalition, 5 Pillars, and contributed to the report produced by the Muslim Council of Britain, Britain's largest Muslim umbrella body, representing more than 500 affiliated mosques, charities, and schools. Calls for the government to adopt a radically new approach titled Our Shared Future, Muslims and Integration in the UK. The report was presented in Parliament, showcases more than 30 diverse voices on integration in Britain, and calls on the government to take on new stances, including backing equal integration. Maz has delivered anti-racist workshops in schools and campaigned against the unjust war on terror, which she links to rising Islamophobia around the world. Maz has appeared on the BBC, Channel 4, Channel 5 and RT, discussing racism, Islamophobia, the refugee crisis, and calls for unity and peace. She is also known for her solidarity and humanitarian aid trips in the UK, Middle East, and across Europe to provide emergency essentials for refugees and migrants. Most recently, Maz has presented documentaries and interviews on hate crime and the hostile environment in the UK. Maz is also one of the key campaigners and organisers for the official Justice for Shukri campaign. Maz will be launching an educational website addressing Islamophobia in memory of her father called Education for Peace in Remembrance of Mohammed Saleem. Welcome, Maz.
Thank you.
So Jess Crombie on Zoom today, sadly, is a researcher and scholar working as a senior lecturer at UAL and as a consultant for the development and humanitarian sector, working with organizations such as the UNHCR, Red Cross, Save the Children, and the DEC. In both contexts, Jess utilizes almost 2 decades as a senior leader in the charity sector to explore documentary image making and ethics and find practical ways to navigate this complex area. Her research focus is investigating the potential for power shifts by seeking out the opinions and ideas of the people who share their stories with NGOs around both the process and their portrayal. Jess commissioned and co-authored the groundbreaking research, The People in the Pictures, and founded and now co-chairs the Bond-sponsored People in the Pictures working group, set up to bring about sector-wide change towards more ethical practices in the creation and use of images of property. And finally, Amak, welcome Amak on Zoom. Amak Mahmoodian was born in Shiraz, Iran, and lives in Bristol, the UK. Amak's work questions notions of identity and home, bridging a space between personal and political. Through her journey, she explores the effects of exile and distance on memory, dreams, and daily life. In 2015, she completed a practice-based doctorate in photography at the University of South Wales, having previously studied at the Art University of Tehran. Working with images, poems, and archives, she looks for the lyrical realities framed in the photographs. Amak has shown her work extensively and won numerous awards. She has published 2 books, Shanaz Me, sorry, Amak, you have to tell us how that's pronounced, in 2016, and Zanjir in 2019. She recently won the Best Photo and Textbook at the Contra Arles in France. Thank you to you all for joining us. And with that, I'll hand over to Desmond to get started.
All right, thanks very much, Shannon, for the introduction, and also to Rossana for inviting me and for putting on this event today. So my contribution to this discussion, which is primarily about images, is going to be the perspective of a journalist who actually mainly writes. But I think it hopefully will be quite useful for you to hear from somebody who works within the media industry, who gets to see the bits of the process that are normally hidden from view from readers and audiences, and how the production of images of refugees and of the wider subject of migration fits into that wider process. As Shannon said in her introduction, I've been writing about refugees, migration, the politics of immigration, and associated topics for quite a while now, and in particular for about 10 years I've focused on the experiences of people who come to Europe in search of asylum, and I spent quite a long period over the last 10 years travelling around Europe, meeting people, interviewing them about their experiences, but also staying in touch and seeing how people's lives developed long term. And I think the main point that I want to make today is to just reinforce the way that images, like any other form of journalistic content that you'll come into contact with, are industrially produced. You know, they're produced by a media industry, and they're consumed and shared, amplified or obscured socially. You know, it's a collective project. There are sort of big commercial and institutional processes that help shape that and help frame what you see, and then there's also the way that we as audiences might collectively respond to those images and bits of writing and bits of content. And I was thinking about points in my work where that's become really apparent, and I just wanted to tell you a little story, first of all, about something that happened to me on a reporting trip quite a few years ago. So almost 10 years ago now, right at the beginning of what's normally called the Syrian refugee crisis, so when millions of people were fleeing the war in Syria, I went to Bulgaria to write about the fact that, and this at the time was an unprecedented occurrence, that quite large numbers of refugees were crossing into Bulgaria, which is an EU country, over the land border with Turkey. So I think this was in 2013, and at the time, you know, the story was, oh, that's unusual, what's happening there? And I went on a trip to a refugee camp in southern Bulgaria, met families there who told me their stories about you know, what they'd fled, what their journeys had been like up to that point, why, despite having left Syria and ostensibly being in a safe country, as you know, that term often gets thrown about now in a way that refugees are discussed politically in the UK, why despite that they were choosing to continue to try and travel onwards towards, first of all, the European Union and then other countries within the EU after that. And after having visited this refugee camp in the south of Bulgaria, Some of the people there told me that, what happens next is that, if we get out of the camp, we can travel to Sofia, the Bulgarian capital, and actually we've heard people there get into quite a lot of difficulties because there's not anywhere for them to stay, so people end up homeless, or they get exploited by people smugglers, or the police, or groups of racists, or other people like that are looking for people to start fights with and to attack and so on. So I thought, well, that's seems like something that's worth reporting on. And I went there, and one of my contacts had said, there's someone there who's got good contacts with the Syrian community in the Bulgarian capital. Here's their number, give them a call when you get there, and they've been speaking to journalists, so they'll probably be able to put you in touch with some people. And I phoned this contact and was quite shocked when I spoke to this person, because essentially I phoned up and said, hi, I'm a journalist, I've just arrived in Sofia to report on this issue, and their response was, well, great, what do you want? Do you want a mother with children? Do you want a single man? Do you want somebody who's had a really horrible experience on their journey? Do you want someone who's traumatized by the war? And essentially gave me a long menu of different character types or different stories for me to pick from, and then at the end said, and of course, we don't insist on payment, but a little gift, a little financial gift might be appropriate in this situation. And so the work that I'd been doing up to that point was quite long-term reporting, where I was writing for pretentious literary magazines like the LRB, who let you go off and do whatever you want. So it was a bit of a shock to me to be suddenly presented with this menu of people to pick from, as if they were all just interchangeable items and could just fit into whatever narrative I wanted to construct. But I tell the story now because actually that's quite a typical dynamic within the way the media works, and at that point I had the luxury of saying no thanks to this person because I wasn't on a tight deadline. It was essentially my own project done under my own initiative, so I could pick and choose what kind of stories I wanted to find and on what basis and so on. But actually the reason that kind of behaviour exists is because the demands of the media industry, the demands of journalism, very often put journalists in situations where they need to behave like that. So I always think, when I think back to that situation, I think, well, if I was a TV news reporter, who'd been flown in for 24 hours to get some footage for that night's news bulletin, that would have probably been extremely helpful to me at that point. And I think that just reinforces the point I want to make, hopefully, that is, whatever we might think of what comes out of the other end of the process with journalism, there are those kind of pressures always at work. And I think in order to have a productive conversation about how you might change the kinds of stories that are told, or the kinds of images that are produced, or who gets to produce them, you really need to understand how that kind of process is there in the first place. One of the really important issues associated with that is how negative and stigmatizing and deliberately hostile or racist forms of imagery relating to refugees and migration are produced. But I'm not actually going to talk about that because I think we're going to hear about some of those issues from some of my colleagues here later. But I wanted to tell you a second little story about how those kind of industrial and collective processes are at work, even with forms of imagery that we might think of as having had positive effects and having even changed attitudes. And the particular image that I wanted to pick up on in relation to this is the very famous picture of a young Syrian Kurdish toddler, Alan Kurdi, who died in the Aegean Sea in 2015 as his family were trying to reach Greece by boat. And the image of a Turkish, emergency worker carrying his body from the beach on the shores of Aegean, went around the world, had, I think, a really important effect right at the end of that summer of 2015 in spurring people to actually go out and protest in the street and demand that their governments do more to facilitate the journeys of refugees and to accommodate them, including in Britain. People remember there were tens of thousands of people on the streets of London in, I think, September, just after those images went around the world. But I think mistakenly, that image is described as having gone viral, as if it was just a sort of spontaneous thing, that the image appeared out of nowhere and people just kind of naturally picked it up and shared it and so on. And that's probably what I thought about it, actually, until I saw a really interesting documentary made by a Dutch TV channel. Unfortunately, I don't think it's available in the UK, but its English translation of its title is A Sea of Images. It was produced in 2016, and it was an investigation into, well, how exactly did that image go viral, so to speak? And I'll try and be as brief as I can about the process there, because it's quite complex, but I think it's a really interesting example of how images like that can get produced. The first thing is that, that year, 2015, every single day, photojournalists were going to those flashpoints of the refugee crisis around the edges of Europe and taking pictures of, shocking and unbearable things, people who had died at sea, people who had been injured, people who were in very traumatic situations, and filing them to agencies that they were either hired by or working for as freelancers. So photos very often are collected by agencies, which will be regional or local. Those agencies will then select which photos they want to put out onto their wires that are then offered to larger media organisations. Then editors at those larger media organisations will choose which ones to take and republish on their own sites. And I think most of the time, probably 90%, maybe even more than that, of really distressing photographs don't make it past that first stage, because editors at the agencies will say, no, we don't want to put that kind of distressing material out onto the newswires. But the photo of Alan Kurdi was submitted to a local news agency in western Turkey, around the Aegean coast, where the disaster happened. The head of that news agency said, well, actually, we had a conversation about this, and this was at an end of a summer where there had been shipwrecks pretty much every day, and we felt that nothing was being done about it by governments that could have stepped in to help. So we made a deliberate decision, we're going to release that photo, and I think even they captioned it with something like, the result of world leaders in action, or something with a very pointed message. The photo was released, didn't actually get that much pick-up from global news organisations until a couple of very prominent human rights activists, people who have senior positions at human rights NGOs, and crucially have large Twitter followings, decided to share the picture to their readership. Then you had a period, and I think there was a study done at Sheffield University showing how that image moved around social media networks where, these accounts with large followings would share it, then sort of ordinary users would share it again, then another large account would pick it up, and it went back and forwards for maybe a few days or even a few weeks, sort of gathering attention in that way. And then at that point, a series of photo editors at national or international media organisations decided, right, we're going to put this image on our front page because we need something to illustrate the fact that this refugee crisis is just sort of seems to be getting bigger and bigger and nothing's been done about it. And there was a really interesting interview with, I think, a photo editor at the Guardian newspaper who was involved in selecting that picture for use on the front page of the Guardian in 2015, who said, well, and we chose that image because obviously, it's a very sympathy-inducing image, even where people have got hostile or ambiguous attitudes towards refugees, sort of the image of a child suggests innocence and, it will provoke sympathy in a wider group of people. But I think she also mentioned the fact that the composition of the image, so of a body being cradled in someone's arms, actually resembled the Pietà, the kind of very prominent image in Western art history of a mother cradling a dead child, which has obviously got these huge religious connotations as well. So there was a sense that this image, at least in the Western imagination, which dominates the global media industry, fit into our sort of set images of, tragedy, sympathy, grief, death, and so on. So that's just to show you that there's this huge hinterland that lies behind pretty much any bit of, media content that you come across. And, all of these things can work together to produce very sympathy-inducing types of journalism, as I think that's an example of, or they can be used to create, hostile attitudes, encourage racism, and so on. But I think in both cases it's worth pausing and thinking, well, is that the best way that those images can be produced, and are the decisions being made the best ones that could be made in that situation? And I think even when you have newspapers, media organisations, perhaps also NGOs, which I think one of my colleagues is going to talk about a bit more later, producing images intended to encourage sympathy for and understanding of refugees or people with difficult migration journeys, they can end up replicating some of the sort of divisions that shape our understanding of these subjects. So I would say that the way that that image of Alan Kurdi was produced and used, I think had some very positive effects, but it fit very much into this framework that I think you see again and again of there being kind of good migrants and bad migrants, that there are deserving and undeserving. And I think that's a political distinction that's made. It's very often echoed and reinforced by media coverage, not just in relation to migration, but lots and lots of different aspects of society. If we talk about poverty and inequality as well, you see these ideas of deserving and undeserving, very prominent in political discussion, and media coverage can end up reinforcing those kind of distinctions in a way that I think is not very helpful. Just to conclude, as I know we want to leave plenty of time for other people to talk, two very brief thoughts on ways in which you can start breaking down those kind of distinctions, but also thinking about other ways in which we can create and shape media coverage. I think in my journalism, where I've had the luxury of time and the ability to think about this, when I've worked with people that I'm interviewing, the idea of collaboration has been really important. So for professional journalists working with people that they're interviewing or seeking to represent in one way or another, trying to find ways that you can give people at least a degree of control over the way that they're being represented. That's never going to be a completely equal relationship, and I think it's quite potentially harmful to pretend it is, but to make sure that people you're working with have a full understanding of how what you're doing is going to be used, and also just kind of making sure there's a kind of ongoing conversation about how people feel their stories or their images are being used, asking them what they think. That can be on the basis of it's still my decision at the end of the day, but I'd like to know what you think about the way that I've presented your story or used your image or so on. But I think it has to be a bit more than that, because I think it has to get at some of these structural considerations that I was talking about as well. And so another huge part of it for me is looking for ways in which you can broaden the range and the tools of people who are actually creating the media. So from a journalist point of view at least, the really important thing to me there that doesn't often get discussed is, well, who actually gets the jobs as journalists? If it is media is being made completely by, say, white middle-class Western journalists like myself, or even if the reporters might be from a more diverse range of backgrounds, but the people making the decisions at the top aren't, then that's a problem. So I think looking for initiatives that can kind of broaden things out on that level is really important. And I will end with just a small plug for something that I'm involved in London, which is a project based at London College of Communication called the Refugee Journalism Project, which aims to provide mentoring and support for exiled journalists who are trying to rebuild their careers in the UK. And it's very much on the basis not that these are people who we just think of as being there to present testimony about their own experiences, but they are professional journalists who can do a whole range of things. And the project is set up to allow people to choose on which of those two bases they want careers in the media. So some of the people we work with actually want to be refugee and migrant advocates. They want to talk about their own stories and their own experiences. Other people just want to go off and report about any other subject that they might choose to. And what I particularly like about that project, which I work with as a kind of advisor, so I'm happy to just plug it and not feel guilty about that, basically, is that it gives people the flexibility to do both. And crucially, it's focused on jobs and having people paid for their work, which, as a freelance journalist, is always extremely important to me. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you. And I'll hand it over to Matt.
In the name of the Most High, Assalamu alaikum. I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me to speak in this absolutely stunning venue today. Thank you so much for that introduction as well, it was amazing. I'm just going to repeat a little of that. So my name is Saleem. I'm the daughter of the late Haji Muhammad Saleem, who was murdered by a Ukrainian neo-Nazi terrorist and mosque bomber called Pavlo Lapshin. I'm an anti-racist and anti-war campaigner, and I've worked tirelessly on the refugee crisis. Are the projections working?
Yeah, that's what
Oh, no, it's wrong. Okay. So I've worked tirelessly on the refugee crisis across Europe and the Middle East, from Calais, Idamini, Alexandria, Athens, all across Greece, Macedonian borders, Turkey, Aleppo, and on the Syrian borders, frontline, providing aid and support to the most vulnerable. I am also the key organiser for the Justice for Shukri campaign, which was a water in Bury in Manchester. I deliver anti-racist workshops in high UKIP area schools and workplaces, and these workshops are called Education for Peace in Remembrance of Mohammed Saleem. And also, I'm also the key organiser and campaigner for the I Am Mohammed Saleem campaign, which lit up government buildings across London to highlight Islamophobic hate crimes and to get the government to officially adopt and recognise a definition of Islamophobia. This is the actual logo for my workshops. It's a silhouette of my father. So it's been 55 years since the Enoch Powell Rivers of Blood speech, 30 years since Stephen Lawrence was murdered, and 9 years since my beloved father was killed in a racist, Islamophobic terrorist attack by a white Ukrainian terrorist. With every precious person you lose in the world goes a library of memories of hope and love. It's been 9 years of the death of my elderly father, Mohammed Saleem, who was murdered by this Nazi who basically shook the hands of the British ambassador in Ukraine, and he was a known Nazi there, and they allowed him into the country in a predominantly Muslim area on a work placement. Apparently a very clever PhD student was already making bombs in Ukraine, part of the Nazi groups there. So he was allowed into Small Heath, Birmingham, which is predominantly a Muslim area, to study, and basically he followed my father home after my father finished his Isha prayers, the final prayers at the mosque, and the mosque is at the end of our street, a walk my father does 5 times a day, most of his life, for over 40 years. And on this particular night, because we live on a quiet cul-de-sac, we know everyone, this Nazi followed my father home and stabbed him from behind at 82 years old. Now, what have we learned in that time? What are the lessons for the children of brave migrants and refugees and their children? Those who don't learn from the past are destined to repeat the same failures. The lessons are contradictory. My father's migrant story is one of enduring success and terrible tragedy, a child of the British Empire and its disillusion. He was a British Asian from the end of the 20th century to the beginning of the 21st, and then he began to be described as a Muslim. A process of othering, of distinct Islamophobia, started to shape the world as a series of wars began to shape the century, painting a false picture of Islam. The so-called clash of civilization, which gave rise to the so-called war on terror, transformed the world's 2 billion Muslims into a homogeneous enemy bloc. This is the background to my father's brutal murder by a terrorist on the streets of the UK. Now, my father was stolen from his wife, his daughters, his sons, his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, but he will always be with us. What drives me to tirelessly campaign today against racism, Islamophobia, is his spirit and soul, which carried him from Pakistan to the world, which he gave time, passion, love and faith. My father came to Britain in the 1950s as immigrants arrived after the war for a better life, but he was met with waves of racism and hostility, an environment that persists today. Upon arriving in 1957, however, my father never allowed the hardships or racial abuse to define him. He worked all his life to educate those around him, sharing his culture from Pakistan, which means the land of the pure, with all those he met. So the I Am Mohammed Saleem campaign is a campaign for the victims of Islamophobia. It was launched on April 2021 on my father's 8-year anniversary to highlight Islamophobic hate crimes and to get the government to officially adopt a definition of Islamophobia. It's been 9 years of the racist Islamophobic murder of my father, but this is not the story of an old man who passed away naturally after living a full life. His passing was politically motivated, and so will always be the commemoration and remembrance. On April the 29th, 2013, as my father was leaving the mosque, he was followed home from the mosque on Isha prayers. Dad always does this walk all the time. This same Nazi went on to put bombs outside 3 mosques in the West Midlands in Warsaw, Wolverhampton and Tipton. This is one of the biggest acts of terrorism on UK soil, but we didn't get the same media coverage. Yet to this day, most people have no idea about this case. This is in part due to the silence of the mainstream media. Whenever terror-related headlines reach our screens, they are often about those who identify with the Muslim faith. Rarely do we hear of the violence of white supremacists who took my father's life. My father, Mohammed Saleem, is sadly not the only victim of Islamophobic attacks and murders. Makram Ali, who's the elderly gentleman at the top, whose 5-year anniversary was just this weekend gone in Finsbury Park. It was 5 years of his anniversary, and he was killed in the Finsbury Park terrorist attack during the holy month of Ramadan in 2017. His attacker, Darren Osborne, who was radicalised by white supremacist ideologies and far-right extremism, murdered him as he drove his van into a group of Muslim worshippers leaving the mosque in North London. Another case is that of Mohsin Ahmed, which is the uncle which is here at the bottom, and that's my father towards the right. Another case is that of Mohsin Ahmed, who was killed by 2 men in a racially motivated attack as he made his way to morning prayers in Rotherham. He was called a groomer, and they stamped on his head and murdered him. Islamophobic attacks and racist verbal abuse are becoming more and more normalised for so many Muslims home and abroad. It has become practically an everyday occurrence. We desperately need action to stop the poison of Islamophobia from spreading any further. An important start here in the UK would be for the official legal recognition of Islamophobia to finally be adopted by this racist government. The UK government continues to reject the Islamophobia definition put forward by several political parties and which campaigners like myself have been fighting for. How can we tackle the rise of Islamophobia without a definition of what it is? My father's death, Makram Ali's killing, and Mohsin Ahmed's murder were perpetrated in the name of white supremacy and Islamophobia. This is a fact. It is not a point of discussion. Therefore, there must be an official recognition of this specific form of hate crime. Ignoring Islamophobia as a category is disrespectful to all these brutal killings of Muslims. It weakens the justice for family members left mourning, and it is an exercise in erasing politically motivated attacks. Murderous and violent attacks do not happen in a vacuum. Individuals are emboldened to act on their hate because they are empowered by the endless racism across social media, biased mainstream headlines and media reporting, and Islamophobic headlines that we are exposed to daily, and the anti-Muslim policies pushed through by this Conservative government. The Tories have used Muslims as scapegoats for their failed policies. They've caused alarming levels of poverty, unemployment and a weak welfare state, which have all led to the disastrous handling of the COVID-19 public health crisis. Too many avoidable deaths and suffering. Muslim, migrants and BAME communities are not the problem. There have been countless calls for the Conservatives to investigate Islamophobia within their own party, especially given that their own leader, Boris Johnson, has likened Muslim women to bank robbers and letterboxes. 3 years on since Boris Johnson agreed to this, nothing has happened. When Boris Johnson called Muslim women letterboxes, Islamophobic incidences rose to 375%. The Tories rely on Islamophobia to curtail everyone's civil liberties through their so-called counter-extremism strategies. These laws, which include the adoption of the Prevent programme, have served to stigmatise and criminalise Muslims of all ages and backgrounds. We have to oppose the fake news which is generated from the top. Michael Gove and Eric Pickles have been at the centre of pushing these divisive ideas. Police and the media have all underplayed the importance of the conversions of hatred against Muslims, which culminated with the murder of my father, along with the killings of Mohsin Ahmed and Makram Ali. These were not isolated incidents. The rise of the far right across Europe and the US has produced a new rationale for hate. And as the waves of war have been produced, an unprecedented unprecedented number of refugees from Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Somalia, Pakistan have all been met by Fortress Europe. Unlike for the Ukrainian refugees, since the tragedy of the war in Ukraine, more than 500,000 people in the country have fled for safe sanctuary as countries welcome refugees into safety, and quite rightly so. The reporting, however, of this tragedy has seen double standards and Eurocentric bias, and that holds one group of lives more valuable than the others who are suffering conflicts in countries such as Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Palestine. This isn't a place, with all due respect, like Iraq or Afghanistan, that has seen conflict raging for decades. Charlie DeGatta, a CBS correspondent in Kiev, stated live on air. DeGatta did not stop there. He went on to say that, you know, this is relatively civilized, relatively European. I have to choose those words carefully too. A city you wouldn't expect that or hope that it's going to happen. As a reporter, he has covered many wars and the human impact of it on refugees throughout the years. So it's very shocking to hear that the lives of those in countries such as Afghanistan, Iraq, and refugees in the Middle East are being devalued in this way. What makes refugees from the countries DeGatta stated any less civilized than those who are fleeing Ukraine? Despite the fact that DeGatta's comments have been called out, and he did issue a swift apology, the biased and racist elements when describing refugees did not stop at his comments. In fact, reporters from other media outlets said things equally offensive. Actually, there's far too many to mention, as I've limited time to go into them all, but I'm sure some of you have observed them on the mainstream media. And it's not just certain media outlets who are perpetuating the idea that refugees coming from Europe are more important than other refugees who have suffered around the world. Prime ministers were drumming in their views too. I don't know if you saw the Polish Prime Minister. They just asked him a question. He just went into a whole rant about Muslims, refugees being terrorists. Is one of the most disgusting interviews I've ever seen. The Bulgarian Prime Minister is another example, having stated that Ukrainian refugees are intelligent and they are educated. This is not the refugee wave we've been used to. People we were not sure about their identity, people with unclear past, who could have been even terrorists. The lack of empathy for refugees facing conflict in other parts of the world is evident from this statement. This shows how desensitized some people in authority are to global human suffering. Putin has launched attacks in the past which have caused excruciating heartache to refugees from Syria, facing mass displacement, death and trauma, but we did not see the level of media attention as we do now. Where is the empathy, the compassion and the media focus on countries such as Yemen, Palestine, Afghanistan and Iraq? The suffering of refugees from these countries is being played down and almost made to seem that their lives are not as important in comparison to those fleeing Ukraine, when the reality is that all victims of war, regardless where they come from or what they look like, should be given equal importance. The dehumanization of people of colour, of those from countries that are not in the West, needs to stop. There are some media organisations which are doing a good job in fair and unbiased reporting of the refugee crisis, but for those newsrooms which have perpetuated such offensive rhetoric, more needs to be done to improve for the future of building a united, wider society which values every single person as a human being. Muslims have become the enemy. We see the same cycle from mainstream politicians whipping up racism and Islamophobia for votes. The Conservative Party competed against UKIP during Brexit to show who is tougher on immigration. Racist populists such as English Defence League and Pekida have produced a toxic atmosphere conducive to terrorist attacks by people such as Pavlo Lapshin, who murdered my father and planted bombs outside 3 mosques in the West Midlands. And we must never forget the brutal murder of Labour MP by Labour MP Joe Cox by white supremacist terrorist Thomas Mayer. And I was reading a recent article, and he didn't like her stance on Syria and supporting Syrian refugees, which is why he did apparently what he did. Only a minority of a British society comes from a migrant background, but these people are overwhelmingly blamed for society's ills. Migration is linked to a lack of housing, loss of jobs and crime, even though the data shows migrants' contribution have actually had the opposite effects. They have like contributed so much in regards to, you know, tax and the economy. Even if you look at the Irish in the 19th century to the recent arrivals of Eastern European, they've all given more than they have ever received. Make no mistake, Theresa May was the architect of the hostile environment for illegal immigrants, contributing to the Windrush scandal. This racist narrative explains the methods developed by the Home Office to attack immigrants and migrant populations. May and her deputy should have resigned at the time for presiding over the willful neglect and persecution of British citizens, denying them basic human rights such as healthcare and pensions. The evidence is clear that the Home Office sought to demonise black and brown migrants. Who else would send go-home vans centred on well-established multicultural communities? This sends a message that neighbours with black and brown skin are to blame for the austerity that you feel. The 2008 global banking crisis sucked $10 trillion from the world's economy. The bailout was conducted amid propaganda that we were all in this together, but it disproportionately affected the disadvantaged. Now, Stephen Lawrence was stabbed and bled to death on the streets of London. His last moments were spent alone in agony. My beloved father was robbed of his life in the same way. It is impossible to imagine what it feels like to have your life ended so brutally. While the racist murderers are to blame, the culpability is shared by the right-wing media and also by the police, but more importantly, by the conscious drive of politicians to earn votes from the gutter. We must never forget that multiculturalism and a multi-faith society is a wonderful thing. We must continue to resist and fight against the people who robbed us of my father's presence. He lives with us now in that struggle for a better world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ghannam, and thank you, Maz, for that incredible framing of some of the issues that we're talking about. Thank you so much. I'm just going to get Jess set up.
Can we just test the sound there?
Yeah, hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Am I very loud?
You're okay. And again, I'm sorry that you can't see Jess. Right. And let's check
if we can just buzz on 2 slides. I'm going to start a little bit later on, if that's all right.
quicker. Yeah, that's you, Jess.
Yeah, great. Okay. Hi, everyone. Sorry you can't see me, but I do have lots of slides, so at least you can look at something on the screen. And also, sorry I can't be there today. Got various sicknesses in my household that are prohibiting me from travelling. I also want to say massive thanks to everyone else on the panel. It's especially the people I've just heard speak. It was very inspiring. Should we go on to the next slide? So I'm not going to do a big intro because Shannon already did a lovely intro already, but I just wanted to say that just to kind of give you a bit of framing of what I'm going to talk about today. I spent a long time in the humanitarian sector, specifically around documentary filmmaking and photography. And my practice today, I split my time, like I said, between being an academic and being a consultant with various organisations like the ones listed here. But really what I'm interested in is what's actually been touched on already today, which is about inserting the opinions and ideas of those who, what I often call the people in the pictures, but the people who, the media and INGOs and other, photographers, filmmakers, those people that they tell stories about. I'm interested in their ideas, what they think about what stories should be told and how they should be told. And so my work is kind of around investigating that and looking at how we can approach that as people who tell stories. If we go on to the next slide. I just want to really quickly share a couple of the kind of common problems that I see within the INGO sector but much more broadly across the media and other ways that we find out about stories, that we see stories about people who might not live in the same country as us, or who some people might feel are different from them. So the first one is around othering. So that's the us and them image here, creating stories that create division rather than trying to tell stories which create a feeling of togetherness. We see that really embedded in the INGO sector where I work, but also really broadly in the media. Then we get saviorism. This is an example of white saviorism here, classic kind of celebrity visiting an overseas INGO project. And then lastly, stereotyping. This is a brilliant TED talk that if you haven't seen it, I very much recommend that you do watch, by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who sums this up in a much more entertaining and succinct way than I ever could, where she says the problem with the single story is that it creates stereotypes. And it's not that stereotypes are untrue, it's that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. And if we just go to the next slide, I kind of wanted to just share with you as well. This is an image which sums up a study that I read a few years ago about stereotyping and what happens when we stereotype and other at a cultural and societal level in terms of how people internalize the stereotypes which are told about them. So stereotyping isn't just not the right thing to do, it also affects how we think about ourselves. And there's actually a lot of interesting studies around gender stereotyping around this, but this is one I wanted to share with you because I was so bowled over when I first read it. So in 2014, US scientists wanted to find out about the impacts of hurricanes based on human responses to hurricane threat. They surveyed 30 years of data, and in the US, every other hurricane is given a male name and every other hurricane is given a female name. Okay, so it's 50-50. And what they discovered was that the female named hurricanes were killing 3 times more people than the male named hurricanes. So that is a statistical impossibility. It's not possible, so that means it's down to a human level. And so what they found out was that people didn't take evasive action when the hurricane was called Shannon, as they would when the hurricane was called Daniel, because intrinsically, deep down at an unconscious level, people in the US believe that female named things are gentler than male named things. Now, this is not a conscious decision-making process that's going on, but I share this as an example of how we all the things that Maz has just been talking about, the things that Daniel's been talking about, these narratives and messages that we hear again and again, we internalize them and they impact not just the ability and the way that we see other people, but also how we see ourselves. And if we go on to the next slide. And so there's kind of a recognition of these issues within issue-based storytelling, wherever it happens. But the arguments about how to solve this problem are, in my experience, are mostly cited in 2 really entrenched positions. So on one side, you have what I'm going to call the engagement frame, which is the argument that we need to raise money and that certain images and stories do this better than others. And when I say raise money, I mean raise engagement, raise people being aware and engaged with issues. And on the other side, you have the values frame, which is that by telling stories which show images or stories around suffering, that you're creating derogatory stereotypes, and so they should never be shown or told. And both of these views hold truth, but also neither of them are solutions. And the people who kind of sit in these frames are a really entrenched stalemate that's been going on for a really long time. So, experiencing that stalemate in a professional capacity myself, I decided that I wanted to go and speak to people, the kind of people that I had been gathering stories from for years and years and years, and find out what they were thinking about these ideas. So I'm going to share one piece of research with you. I've carried out several pieces of research. If we go to the next slide, which Shannon mentioned in my introduction, is called The People in the Pictures, and I carried it out in partnership with Save the Children. I spoke to 205 people, women, men and children across 4 countries, so Niger, Bangladesh, the UK and Jordan. And in Jordan, I was talking to the Syrian refugee population there. And I asked them questions about 3 areas. If we go to the next slide, the first one was, why did they agree to share their story with a media partner or an NGO? And you know, there's lots and lots of detail in this, but largely it was because people wanted to raise awareness of what was going on, because they were aware that by doing that they would be helping other people, kind of, yeah, what you'd expect. People really wanted as well to tell their story themselves, so they wanted to have a voice and be heard by others. They also, for some people, they were feeling in a desperate place, and they hoped that if they shared their story, maybe they would be able to you know, to be helped in some way. And lastly, there was an existing relationship with an organisation like Save the Children or whoever else who had assisted them in some way, and they felt kind of, you know, it's a quid pro quo type scenario. We'll give something back because something was given to us. And for that, there was a feeling of kind of being able to have some kind of power in that situation by doing that as well. And if we go to the next slide, so around the process, the actual moment of having your story gathered, and I use this image quite deliberately because this is quite typical, you know, often that's, you know, it's someone white and Western, you know, this doesn't happen quite as much as it used to, but it certainly happens a lot, going into a space where they are not from culturally or ethnically. And so I wanted to find out around process. And so most people were really quite satisfied with the image making process, and some found it, you know, it was cathartic, or it was a friendly process. However, on the kind of less positive side, and Daniel touched on this around the idea of consent, which is a kind of troubling word because people think of it as just signing a form. You know, as soon as you say, oh, we need to gather consent, everyone thinks, oh yeah, brilliant, we'll just get them to sign a form and that's it, we're done. Whereas consent is, as Daniel indicated, an ongoing dialogue with people. And because that wasn't happening, most people didn't really feel that they were appraised fully of the purpose of, you know, their involvement in the storytelling process. They also didn't get to see what they ended up in. So someone came, they spent the day with them, they filmed with them, they photographed them, they interviewed them, and then they went away and that was it. They never heard from them again. So that was really problematic for people, obviously. And then lastly, children who had, you know, were often not included in the process of discussions around stories. They were just kind of, you know, their parents were asked or their guardians were asked, and then they were just sort of, you know, mic'd up like this young boy is here, felt really strongly about their need to be a part of that process as well. And then lastly, around portrayal, if we go to the next slide, so this is the debate. So you know, I work in academia, and a lot of the academic texts, well, lots of them, you can't see me, but lots of books behind me, and lots of them are about this topic, are about what we as audiences think about the portrayals that we see in the media and by INGOs of suffering in various, you know, situations. But I wanted to find out, well, what do the people themselves think about those things? So we showed people a range of materials, from the kind of really stereotypical, not great materials, through to some things that could be argued as being, you know, a bit better. And we asked them, you know, what do you think about this, with a series of questions. And what was really interesting, what came out very strongly, was people just wanting to have power over their own representation. And this came through in a number of ways. So people said in very sophisticated language, you know, yeah, we get that you need to show images of suffering to support the need for fundraising. Like, we understand that. And this was, everyone was saying this to us. And most people were kind of, they'd look at the, you know, film of their child or someone, you know, who in their community in a film which, you know, was potentially quite stereotyping, and they'd say, well, you know, that is a true thing that happened in my life. You know, it's not made up. However, you know, people felt, again, because the consent process wasn't very rich, they felt that they weren't quite sure about the consequences of that and felt concerned. But then what came through really strongly was that they didn't want that picture, story, film of that moment in their life where they were having a difficult time to be the only story that was ever told about them. And they wanted to see pieces of content where people spoke for themselves. You know, they didn't want that thing to be their single story. And so I'm just going to share a few quotes if you go on to the next slide. So in Niger, every single person we spoke to said to us this proverb, a song is nicer from its owner's mouth. Everyone would just say that over and over again, like, well, obviously, you know, a song is nicer from its owner's mouth. And people expressed, preference for pieces of content where the people who were in the content, in the films, were speaking for themselves and, being part of a solution. As we all know, right, people are not just sitting around passively waiting for support. They are actively engaged in their own lives. And so, and the people we spoke to wanted to see that. And then lastly, rather brilliantly, with these older Syrian children in Jordan, they said, I want to take the photos, not be an object. And they want to see pictures, we want to show pictures taken by us, which was just so great to hear. So if we go on to the next slide. So after this, I started to kind of think about, in my role within the INGO sector, what do we do with this information? There's lots of kind of entrenched positionality within the NGO sector, that certain things, you can't see me doing air quotes here, but work, that there's certain ways to tell stories and you can't divert from that. And so I started trying to get the sector to do some testing and learning. And there was a number of projects I worked on. I'm just going to share a couple with you now. So this was a project with the same objectives as the Refugee Body Project, which was raising the voices of those who are experiencing something, in this instance being a refugee and living in Zaatari camp in Jordan. And so we worked with these young people. They were aged between 14 and 18 for a year, or 18 months actually, and with a photo voice way of working, where we trained them to take cameras, to use cameras and tell their own stories. But then we thought one of the things that they were experiencing was they didn't have any way of communicating properly with the outside world, because Zaatari camp is quite closed, and that was frustrating to them. So we set them up and helped them run, although they made all the editorial decisions, an Instagram account, which they use in order to have conversations with other young people around the world and share their kind of images and stories about their lives in Zaatari. I could talk about this project a lot longer, but I don't have time. So but it's still around if you want to look it up. If we go on to the next slide, we then worked on a project with refugee children from Tanzania living in Burundi and from Syria living in Lebanon, where we wanted to work with these children to ask them what stories they wanted to tell and how they wanted to tell them. So often what happens, as Daniel described, is that you kind of get into this situation and you've got an already decided narrative in your mind, and and what happens as a journalist or as a reporter, you'll go in and be like, I want to talk to a mother with 2 children, whatever. So we were trying to scotch that way of working, and instead go to these kids and say, what stories do you want to tell? Not what stories of hope do you want to tell, or what stories, but just plainly, what stories do you want to tell? And we decided we would do this by working with this artist called Patrick Willock, who builds these stage sets, which take weeks and sometimes months to build, and then people sort of pose inside the stage set that they have constructed based on whatever story they wanted to tell, and then the photograph is the final result of this kind of weeks and months of collaboration. So we worked with these children and their wider communities. There were, seamstresses and carpenters and painters and all these people who were, paid for their time, that came in and helped us construct these sets. And some children wanted to tell stories about their kind of hopes and dreams for the future. This is a little boy on the left who wants to be a doctor to tackle malaria. And a little incidentally on that story, the child dressed as a mosquito on the right was supposed to be lying down dead, but was unwilling to do that in the photo, and so is still standing up, a bone of contention during the process. The little girl, the photograph in the center, the little girl on the far left carrying the baby on her back, wanted to tell the story of her and her siblings fleeing over the mountains between Burundi and Tanzania overnight, and how she carried her sibling. And the girl on the right just doesn't get to be a princess very often, and just wanted to build a princess castle and dress up in pink and be a princess in her photo, and fair enough. And so, the idea though was that, it was about saying, what story do you want to tell, and how can we facilitate you telling that story? And so it got a lot of press and interest and some significant kind of funding, because it did really, really well and became quite well known. But it was still kind of seen by my sector, by the INGO sector, as a bit niche. And this kind of way of working, of shifting editorial power, wasn't really being accepted at a mainstream level. So before I finish, I just want to share very quickly, if we go on to the next slide, one additional piece of research. So What I wanted to test in this piece of research was what happened when you handed over editorial control entirely, in terms of what story was told, how it was told, who was taking the photos, who was writing the copy, completely, but for a fundraising purpose, because that's the bit where everyone gets nervous. Oh, they say it's a media story, that's fine, but when it comes to raising money, oh no, we don't want to do that. And so a wonderful organization called AmRef Health Africa, who are based in Nairobi, but who have fundraising offices in the UK and the US, agreed to put their fundraising money on the line, thanks to AmRef, and test what happened when we did that. And so we did a head-to-head test where we had one fundraising leaflet made by a guy called Patrick Malaki, who lives in Kibera in Nairobi in Kenya, and one fundraising leaflet made by AmRef themselves, and they went head to head and to see, how donors would respond, and the donors didn't, it was a blind test, the donors didn't know that they were seeing something that had been created entirely by Patrick. And I don't have time to go through in a lot of detail now, but I just want to share the results because they were very interesting. So the kind of headline result is that the fundraising leaflet made by Patrick raised more money. So that was great. I was really pleased to see that. But perhaps most interestingly, when we surveyed the donors later on to ask them why, they had donated what they donated, they said that they recognized that this leaflet was created by someone with lived experience of this topic. And they felt this gave the story authenticity and that it created a much stronger connection between them and the issues being described than the one created by AmRef did. And really interestingly, white, middle-aged, middle-class donors from the kind of home counties of the UK also said things like, yeah, I like this because it challenges colonial stereotypes, which I will admit I was quite surprised to see, but also really pleased to see. So yeah, interesting, right? So if we go on to the next slide, just to kind of wrap up, also, these are the 4 people who are involved in the process, Refa, Patrick, Fatuma and Kevin. And what they also said was, when we talked to them about the process, this is great because I'm the one who tells my story. In Kibera, in Nairobi, there are film crews in there all the time. It's always other people deciding what story to tell, but this is me telling this is me rather than the world telling my stories. So, which is great. So if we just go to the next slide. There's a title on the next slide. Just realized Kerr research takeaways I've written instead of key research takeaways. Sorry about that. But the kind of key things that I now take into the organizations I work with to help them think about what they're doing in terms of storytelling. Firstly is the idea of dignity is really important, but you cannot decide what is dignified on behalf of someone else, which happens a lot by well-meaning people. They're well-meaning, but ultimately they're stripping power away by doing that. Secondly, people want to be involved in telling their own stories and in the way we choose to tell them. Categorically, they want that. And there's again assumptions that, they're not literate, or these people, don't have access to mobile phones and maybe they won't understand. That's rubbish. Everyone I've spoke to understands. Thirdly, stories told in partnership with people help to challenge stereotypes and othering. We saw that from the way the donors responded in a surprising and really great way. And they really like that as well. That's something that is a positive and a reason to get engaged with issues. And lastly, people don't mind showing stories that show something difficult happening in their life. That is not an issue, but they don't want that to be the only story that's ever told about them, which they recognize is often the situation right now. So for my last slide, I just want to say, so what I'm trying to move to in my work, and I'm really not there right now, but I'm kind of edging towards it, is a place where these two entrenched positions of the engagement frame and the values frame are sort of dropped in exchange for a place where we're looking towards contributor-led, I think, often described as participant-led storytelling, which is where we implement a process where people with lived experience lead the process of deciding what story is being told and how to try and how to tell it, which I hope will challenge some of the kind of not positive stereotyping dominant media narratives that we see today. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jess. That was fantastic. So now we have Amak. Amak and I were planning to do an in-person kind of audience participation segment. I'm not too sure how that's going to work, but we can give it a try. Over to you, Amak.
Perhaps we can just see for a moment 5 minutes of thinking and trying to remember our memories. Hi everyone, I hope you are really well, and I am absolutely grateful, and it's a pleasure being here, although I'm so sorry I won't be able to see you, but it's a great pleasure to be among you, and thank you Rossana and Shannon for the invitation. Through this conversation and this talk, I try to explore, and I am interested to know how the subjects of these photographs, and how people as refugees or people in exile, including myself, feel about being photographed or being presented by their own people or by others. And I start this talk with a poem, which is in response to the exile and what I experienced. And perhaps the reason of using the poem is because it's a universal language, and it is easier sometimes to communicate through the poems and photographs rather than talking through the media and in a more formal way. Today, I think about things that I forgot to remember. I remind myself to remember. If I am afraid of the life I have created in the photographs, it's because of my dreams. I dream, I remember, with no family but memory, with no land but traces. My land travels within me. I live in the past. I have created a life of memories. If you could kindly go to the next slide, please, Shannon. Perhaps, I don't know, among us, we are people as Daniel, I guess, Maz, Rossana, Shannon, all of us, we might experience exile, the forced one, or something which has been chosen by us. And we thought with Shannon to ask you to share if you have a memory, if you have a photograph, but I'm not sure how it goes. So perhaps I can just carry on talking. I guess it would be better, Shannon. What do you think? Yeah. So we all carry our memories within us, memory of going to the school for the very first day, let's say, or having a journey with our family to see the sunset, or buying the very good book for the first time by our pocket money. And some of us remember war, family, home, revolution, exile. These are all our memories. They belong to us. It could be a memory of mess. It could be a memory of me buying a book and having conversation with my dad, or it could be her memory of the moment they knock at the door to say your dad is dead and he's gone, as she mentioned. When these memories start to fade, we rely on ourselves to remember them and to recall them and to recreate them. And sometimes they are photographs. They are photographs of those people, those land, those events which we love. Those photographs are here to apprise us of what had happened in the past, but what exists in our present time, in the place and in the time when past and present meet, and they create a new narrative, which is the narrative of life. It's a narrative of resistance. And in the light of what's happening globally right now in many countries, including Afghanistan, Syria, Ukraine, it is a narrative of many people's lives. And today I decided not to start with Zanjir, the project which is more related to the memories perhaps, but instead I like to start with Shanasname. If we can please go to the next slide, Shannon, next one. And then next, and it's a video. If you could kindly just click on that. So this project calls, it's Shanasname, as Shannon mentioned. Shanasname tells us both the story of the women who feature in this book, and also the ways in which photography functions in political, personal, and social level. Shanasname is the name of official Iranian birth certificate. Does it work?
No, not yet.
No?
Just give me 1 second.
Okay,
Can
absolutely.
we test the video? Does that video link work?
Yes, I think it works. It's a bit
Working?
Yes, yeah, perfect. That is Shanasname, that booklet, and absolutely is the same size and same format as what you see in this video. Shanasname is the name of official Iranian birth certificate. It is valid for life, but the photograph which it contains must be updated according to the standards. 13 years ago, I was waiting in a reception room, holding the birth certificate of my mother and myself. My eyes began to flick from the picture of my mother to the picture of myself and back again. A sudden realization came upon me of what these pictures meant, of what they showed and what they didn't show in these contexts. My mother and I, for all our differences, were welded into one being. I looked like my mother and she looked like me. But it went beyond that. All of a sudden, I realized that all Iranian women were being restricted to look the same, like us, plain faces under hairless scarves. The same day, my fingerprint was fixed next to my image, and my mother's fingerprints were fixed next to her image. And though the faces had some similarities and were absolutely the same, the fingerprints were so different. And it shows that very small part of our being could show and present how different we are from each other. That was the reason of starting working on this project. So I started collecting these ID photographs of Iranian women and also the ID images of different people in Iran, in Tehran, Karaj, different cities. And beside that, I started to take and collect the fingerprints. The reason of fingerprints, it was first, I wanted to invite the audience to look closer, to look at these people with different eyes, because that identity, that fingerprint is part of their identity, which cannot be changed and cannot be restricted by any regime, any religion. And that is part of their being. And also collecting the ID photographs was a reason to have conversation with my subjects. And as Daniel said, it's really fundamental to have opportunity to talk to subjects and see what they want and how they want to be presented to. Working on this project for 2 years in Iran, later on, it became a book in 2016. And because of the content of the book, it became a political book. And it was in response of my own experience in the UK as an Iranian girl. I wasn't a refugee, I wasn't in exile those days. But for many people, it was really difficult to believe, to understand that an Iranian girl can do a PhD, or I don't have to carry my scarf all the time and I have another identity. Therefore, I became interested in ethnic identity. Even in the most diverse cities in this world, stereotypes and blind knowledge about people, which have been mostly created through the media, about ethnic groups, it leaves no room for individuality of these people. And always these stereotypes and these perceptions create an identity without knowing these people. And that was the reason, and that is the story behind Shanasname. Shanasname became quite political. Therefore, I was suggested by my lawyer not to go home and to wait and to see what would be a result of the media. And I am still waiting and I am careful, but at the same time, I feel like as a person in exile, I have this opportunity to become the speaker of people who are in there and they don't have this opportunity to talk. If you go through the next slide, please, Shannon. The one with the shadow, yes, the next one. And perhaps we can carry on this slide because they are all photographs. It would be easier. So just to give you a history of my background, I was born in Iran, and I was born after the Islamic Revolution, and that changed from the kingdom to the Islamic state in my country. And at the same time, we were in the midst war between Iran and Iraq. So the revolution and the war, they did affect Iranian family, including my family. In result of that, many of family, they had to leave the country. And also my father had to leave and he went to Paris. Therefore, I had just a photograph of him as the evidence of his being, as the evidence to have conversation with him. And I started to communicate with the photographs of my family. And those frozen memories within those photographs became quite precious for me. And later on, I decided to study photography at Art University of Tehran. And I was really lucky to have Bahman Jalali, you see his photographs on that slide, as one of my tutors. And through the tutorials which we had together, if you go through the next slide, please, he told me that he knew I was interested in family archives and family photographs. So he suggested me to go and visit this place, which is the Golestan Museum in heart of Tehran in Iran. It is in the city center. And this is the place of archival materials belong to 18th century and 19th century when photography arrived in Iran, in Tehran. Next slide, please. But in that place, absolutely is the same yard. In 1856 was the principal residence of the King of Iran and his family, the women and daughters and the relatives of the king. And that is the time when photography arrived to Iran, Tehran. Next one, please. And this was the King of Iran. He was known as the first modern monarch, and he became the first family photographer of Iran because he was very much interested in the photographs, in photography. And before being introduced to photography, he was a painter. Next slide, please. And through the research, I found 17 paintings of him, and in most of them, the subjects were back to the painter because it required less details. But then photography arrived. Next slide, please, Shannon. I'm sorry. And that was a miracle for him because he could use the camera and express himself and document what was happening around him. And among his subjects, if you go to the next slide, please, they were the women of Harem. When I started working on this project, when I started working in that museum, because I was accepted my proposal was accepted, and I started to go through these family archives to identify these people and to identify the names and where they belong to, and just kind of categorize those albums. If we go through the next few archival photographs, I appreciate it. So while I was working on these archival materials, as you see in these slides, it was really interesting to learn more about these people and their lives. And I was interested to know more about them. Therefore, I didn't limit myself just to know about them through the photographs. I started to read their diaries and their handwriting and thinking about them as the subjects of these photographs. And through this research, it was really interesting. I was looking for differences between that era, 19th century in my country, and the contemporary era, what I was experiencing until this moment with this slide. As you see on the right-hand side, you see a photograph of a female in a private domain, photographed by the King of Iran. On the left side, you see the public domain and the way these females were represented. And in the next slide, you see after 106 years in my country, I was experiencing the same thing. The right side is a wedding of my friend with us in one of the parties, indoor and private domain. And the left side, that is something which you see through the media when they are talking and they are presenting the females in Iran. Therefore, I decided to combine these two eras and talk about similarities. If you go please through the next slide, Shannon. I invited those archival materials within my practice to tell my stories through the others who did live before us, but their life and their experience still exist. It was absolutely part of my contemporary experience as a woman in Iran. If you go through the next slides. So I started to conceal the faces of contemporary people behind the mask of the past, and to construct the identity, because these identities has been constructed through the regime, has been constructed through the others, and has been constructed through the media. Therefore, I was interested, and perhaps I was inviting people to become more curious to know what these photographs reveal rather than conceal. The project, working on that, I started with people, if you go through the next slide, please, working with people who I knew, people around me, and later on through the project, I took this mask outside in public places in hope of having conversation with people. And again, because subject matter is always important for me as a photographer, as a researcher, and I wanted to have their experience, and it became a performative identity. If we go through the next few slides, Shannon, perhaps 4 more slides. And what was performative identity for me? It was that identity which created a string between past and present. And these people wanted to become connected and at the same time disconnect from that past and show their real selves and the real identity which was selected and chosen by them rather than others. So working on this project from 2004 to 2009, the project was closed in 2009. And it became part of my PhD research. And later on in 2017, the person who published my first book, the publisher, they contacted me and they told me that they were interested in publishing the second book and they were interested in this project. And I naively thought that it would be really easy because it has been closed since 2009 and I would be able to edit it and send it to them and everything would be quite easy. But then I arrived home actually in this room and I was surrounded, if you go to the next slide, Shannon, and the next one with my dad and my mom. I was surrounded by photographs, almost 3,000 photographs in the next slide. And people who I could remember, but I was feeling quite distant from because I was working on this project after 2 years of distance and after 2 years of hope of returning home. And this slide actually, and the next one, they became quite important and significant in creating the new narrative. Because in this, you see, even without hiding and covering the face behind the mask of the past, they were part of my past. Because I haven't seen my mother for 11 years and my dad, unfortunately, he passed away without me seeing him. And I realized that anyone and everyone can turn to a mask and everyone can carry a mask of the past because of the situation and the circumstance which we experience. Therefore, the narrative became the narrative of exile and the new narrative of my life. And also I was following this assertion by Roland Barthes that photography is more akin to magic than art, and it can repeat something which cannot existentially be repeated again. And for me, it was kind of a therapy of become again connected to my past and family. If we go through the next slides, but through these photographs, I should say, while I was wandering through these photographs, I found it quite difficult to find a new narrative of this work. Therefore, I started to have imagined conversation with the Persian princess who lived 135 years before me. Can you go to the next slide? And that was her book. As I said, while I was working in the Tehran Museum, I was introduced to her work. And she was one of those girls in that harem. And her book, it is quite interesting. It's like Marcel Proust's book, although it doesn't have even not one single image, but it was visualizing those moments of those people's lives. Therefore, I started this imagined conversation between me and her, and she helped me to find my path to my pastime and to create that new narrative within the same project. If you go through the next slide, please. And that is her. She was an activist. Here, as you see, she had decided, because she wanted to be photographed by a stranger photographer, so she decided to wear male's outfit, which was her decision. And she was the first woman who decided to take off her scarf as a Persian princess in the court. And she wasn't happy in her marriage. She asked for divorce, and she was looking after for her 3 children, and she knew 4 languages. And I am talking about a girl who was born in 1883. So these conversations became quite important in talking about my people and women in my country in the same time too. If you go through the next slide and the next one. So our conversations began, and it was her writings and my photographs. But while I was working on this project, there were moments in our conversation which I didn't have, although I had 3,000 negatives, but I didn't have a photograph to absolutely complete that moment of conversation. Therefore, I started to write my poems. And instead of writing with the light on paper, which is photographic, and that is how we describe it, I decided to write with words again and write the poems in response to her writing when I didn't have the photo. And I was following this assertion by Robert Walser, who says, one cannot use the life to interpret the work, but one can use the work to interpret the life. And that is something which we all experience, I think, with our work and with our life. Therefore, this project became a conversation through the photographs, archives, poems, to talk about people's experience in exile. I will read one of the poems, and feel free to go through the slides, Shannon. Thank you so much for this. You are great. To anticipate death for myself will simplify it, but to anticipate it for whom I love makes everything unpleasant. They die before they die, and I am scared of that. I know she is alive, as he is, but not with me, not for me. When I talk to her, it feels like our last conversation, and tomorrow, and the day after. She is there. We will never meet again. When these thoughts surround us, hold us, take us, they are dreams. I shot in my own body, you shot in yours. And that is what I wanted to share with you today. And the project, which is really interesting, talking to people from Iraq, Poland, Ukraine, Russia, China, people in exile. The project which I am currently working on, and there are a few last slides of this work, it's about people's dreams when they live and experience the exile. And it again started with my very personal experience. And I was interested in the theory of Heraclitus, which he says, when we are awake right now in this place, all of us today, we are sharing the same world and the same experience. But when you sleep and when you close your eyes, right now, when you go to sleep and close your eyes, you create your own world. And it's your individual world, and nobody can enter, and you cannot leave that, and you become the observer of your dream. Therefore, I am working and I am in conversation with people in exile who have not any opportunity and not any chance to go home. And I construct their dreams within imagery. Thank you very much.
So at this point, we presentation. If anyone would like to share any responses to Amak's poetry, please do that. We're going to run around with microphones. If you have any questions for the panel, that would be brilliant as well. Anybody?
Thank you all for that. That's great. I was wondering, in this era of mass self-generated content, do you think, what's that done to some of the issues you've been talking about around representation? Has it made it easier? Has it made it more difficult? Has it just made it more complicated? I just wonder what you're thinking in the internet age about the impact of that on representation.
Was that for me specifically?
Yeah, for anyone.
I think, like, if you think back to the story I was telling about how that photo of Alan Kurdi circulated, I think that shows how it's at very least added another sort of layer of complexity to those things. I don't think it's sort of either or whether it's made it better or worse, if you see what I mean, because social media and the internet is also a huge structure and an industry as well. It's just that the way people interact with it is different to the traditional media. So there are huge power imbalances there as well. You know, like I described, someone who's the head of a human rights NGO who's got several 100,000 followers can tweet a picture and it has a very different effect to if somebody takes the picture themselves and shares it with a few hundred followers. But I think there's more room for sort of that sort of back and forth relationship. Like, pressure can be brought from outside the traditional parts of the system, and it's also much easier to at least expose where more traditional media organisations are deliberately or not leaving gaps. I mean, this is a completely different example, but if you look on Twitter over the last 24 hours at you look at the media coverage of the RMT strikes in newspapers and TV channels, and then look at the way clips and screenshots of that coverage is then being used on Twitter, there's clearly the ability to have a very lively and very large and sometimes quite influential commentary on the way the media is doing something. So that's a big difference that didn't exist before. But that can go in all sorts of directions. You know, I personally, because I support those strikes, was delighted to see all the clips of Mick Lynch, the RMT's leader, wiping the floor with all these TV presenters and Conservative politicians he was up against. But also the exact same freedom to do that has been used by Nigel Farage to whip up fears around people crossing the channel in boats. So that's just to say it's neither good nor bad, but it sort of allows people to bring pressure to bear on the system in new ways that weren't there before, I think.
Jess?
This is a very quick thing to add, which is in a very, very tangible way. The impact, and sorry, I cannot have the question properly, but the impact of the Ukraine on the issues in terms of the stories that are being told, other things are being forgotten, and in a very tangible way. I spent last week with a bunch of humanitarian leaders from across West and Central Africa who were saying that they are having their budget cut and their funding cut because of Ukraine and the stories that are being told.
Thank you. Another question or comment from the panel?
I was just going to say that I think it's become more and more important for us to offer that alternative narrative. I remember during lockdown, Nigel Farage came down to Hastings and he broke the lockdown rules, and he was posting an image of himself talking to a fisherman and saying, that they were spreading, just causing kind of alarm about boats arriving and people not wanting them here. And we got, we were in lockdown, so we decided as a buddy project that we needed to create something, we needed to get our view across somehow. So we contacted a local artist, Sarah Gomez-Harris, and got her to do the myth-busting animated cards that were shared on social media around that time, thousands and thousands of times around, sort of locally in East Sussex. We followed the postings, and we felt that that's how we were being able to kind of offer an alternative narrative to what was being promoted in our local news as well. So I think, if anything, it's made us feel like we have to be ready, we have to be the organisations that are there creating that alternative narrative.
Anybody have another question? I can jump on this one if you need. I was just going to ask, Daniel, I was really interested in what you said about, and it made me think of something, you were talking about the longer term, the impact of longer term storytelling, with your example of, you had people that were like, we can quickly get you what you need. And it made me think about budget, the dirty kind of money, but the budget that's required to do long-term journalism. And it made me also think about the fact, are we paying for our journalism? Something for everybody to think about. Any thoughts on that? And maybe Jess also might have some thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, budget is really important. Whether I think in most cases, long-term projects take investment. Whether that might not be large amounts of money up front, but it's just having editors with the resources and the time to keep in touch with reporters, for instance, even if it's something relatively low budget like what I did, which is essentially just going and writing about things. I can do that by myself to a certain extent, but you need an editorial structure that is going to know how to deal with that and have an editor who's actually got the time to, check in with you and talk about it, and they then have the resources to work out how to promote that properly at their end. So, for instance, one place I write for quite often is a bit of The Guardian called The Long Read, but which publishes pieces that can take up to a year in some cases, and are like sort of 4,000 to 6,000 words, which is very long for a bit of written journalism. But there are lots of other places on the internet where you can publish things at that length or take that amount of time, but they haven't got the resources to shape it in a way that means more people will read it. So that stuff always matters. Although I would say it's not that doing things longer term automatically makes them better or more considered or gives them better ethics. It's more that organisations have to spend the time thinking about what that is. The product could be something very quick moving and reactive at the end of that, but it's about having doing the thinking at the correct bits of the process, but that's where the resources come in more to me. That means you have to have stuff that's properly staffed with good management that's giving people the time and the space to do that.
And I guess also where the question of representation comes back in, who is contributing to that work. And it made me think of a statistic. I think I saw recently something like only 20% of journalists in the UK come from working class backgrounds at the moment.
Yeah, at most, I would say. I think it's got worse in the last 10 years as well, sadly.
And just to salute you and all the work that you're doing. And I feel that my parents came over in the 50s from Jamaica. And when I speak to my mum now, she talks about how, they make you welcome. Well, they didn't make her welcome, but ostensibly they make you welcome. But now, with the Windrush debacle, how the story changes and that, we're welcoming people with Ukraine now, but what would it be like in 2 years' time or 3 years' time, and how important it is that we keep the work going because things change. And just some of the things that you said, and it's really good how we welcome people from the Ukraine, but for me it's very interesting that I see people important because I feel like we are getting separated. And I was having some conversations, going to some older ladies, and she said, I don't mind giving to the Ukraine, but I'm not giving to the Americans or boats because, you know, and it's like they're just watching in the media and just being fed this. So it's really important that we just stand together and we don't allow this separation narrative.
Sorry. I think we're all a bit dumbstruck, you know, and also we're taking on the talk's very fascinating. Yeah, a lot to think about, a lot to process. I've actually got a specific question for Maz about Islamophobia and definitions, which were very, obviously, you made your case why you're so committed to definition. I have a concern about definitions, and we've seen it for other groups that are oppressed or discriminated against. And I don't know, I'm just interested in what you think about how much that might fuel division. So picking up on Leal's point just made about how the media will try and make out, like, you know, the differences are more important. So how much does definitions, rather than talking about racism and different forms of racism, and, you know, the point about white supremacy, which were pretty against Eastern Europeans, you know, this idea that with the Ukrainians, exactly the point that they're so welcome. Anyway, I'm just interested because I've been battling about definitions and trying to pose fake definitions. I won't bore you with these, not relevant here. And I'm just interested in your take, why you think it's so important and if you see any risks with pushing for a definition.
Yeah, I think it's extremely important because we have a definition of anti-Semitism. So we should.
Definition I was referring to.
Yeah, but also for me personally and for people in my community, it's important to recognise attacks that, you know, even the comments that come from the top of this Tory government are Islamophobic and racist, calling Muslim women bank robbers and letterboxes. That fueled a 375% increase in attacks on Muslim women. And where I live in Finsbury Park, Muslim women were pushed in front of buses for simply looking visibly Muslim. So we have to have something to define what that form of racism is, because it's a specific form of racism, because you are attacking someone and disliking someone for the way they look and dress. So I think it's extremely important, especially for my case as well, because even to have my father's, you know, Pavlo Lapshin was charged under terrorism laws. Yet today, whenever there's a terrorist attack in this country or around Europe, the BBC always miss my father's terrorist attack off the list. I go back and forth with them. They call it a far-right attack. And it's a far-right terrorist attack because he was charged under terrorism laws. So for me, I feel like personally it's very important for me to have a definition, because it's like just pushing it under the mat and saying, well, there you go, you know, it doesn't mean anything to anyone. So specifically for my community of people and for my family, I think it's really important.
I just wanted to add, we're going to have to wrap up as well. But I just wanted to add, if people haven't had a chance to have a look in the Hastings Independent Press, Alex from the Refugee Body Project has created, has written an incredible article which really has done an amazing job about outlining some of these issues. I really recommend that you have a read of that. One of the things that I read, which I had no idea, and I think speaks to a lot of the issues around, you know, in terms of information, in terms of language that we're using around some of these things. She has a statistic in the article which is, I think, 10,000 people have arrived in boats. I'm not sure what the period is. 10,000 people versus 40,000 Ukrainian refugees, which was the figure from May. And she talks about the fact that we're talking about this idea of a flood, a crisis, and
swarm. Yeah, no, the warm.
I think that was really powerful use of data. Any final thoughts? Maybe one more question?
We looked at something other than the Does it speak now?
Closer.
Okay, keep it closer. I think there's some aspect of this that came out in the last contribution about memory. Now, anybody who's a refugee, say arriving in this country at the age of 20, there's a big chunk of that person's life that's lost. And whatever images put forward about that place in the conflict, nursery rhymes, whatever makes up your childhood, your early life, and it's almost like it's completely curtailed. And I feel, when I listen to refugee talk, I always feel that we miss out this tremendous feeling of loss that that person has to endure. And I feel there's racism that is being diminished by not having correct use of language. There's a whole, that I'm just so conscious of how hard that part of the refugee project must be. In the midst of all the other issues that we're dealing with, and I felt the last Iranian contributor managed to make that clear, that she was something before she came here. And I feel really often, I mean, for example, you don't have any school-age friends, you haven't got any of the things that a person growing up in a country has got. And that makes me terribly sad.
Thank you. I hope you know that.
So, with that in mind, I want to say a huge thank you to everybody who attended today. A huge thank you to all the staff at the Delaware team who have made us feel so welcome today, to all the staff and volunteers at the Refugee Buddy Project. There's lots of buddies here today. Thank you for coming. And to everyone else that's here today. I do want to leave on one note, though, to say that the attack and the mistreatment of people seeking refuge in the UK is increasingly becoming more and more hostile. And I think it's really important that all of you here today, I'm sure you've already made a stand in solidarity with people seeking refuge, but we need to get out there, we need to speak to everybody, we need to challenge the treatment of people seeking refuge. The stopping the Rwanda flights was a huge success that brought together the NGOs, the legal organisations, the trade unions, faith organisations, the grassroots community organisations everywhere got together to stop the Rwandan flights. And we need to increase that movement. That movement has to get bigger because the Rwandan flights are not going to stop. And there are other plans afoot as well with the mistreatment of refugees. Again, you know, I'm sure I don't need to remind you, you know, they're coming for the refugees, everyone else is next. So I think we need to, you know, just get out there, speak as many people as possible, and stand in solidarity with refugees. Thank you.